The documents, Mr. Speaker, reveal a shocking disregard for Canada's national security.
When did the Minister of Health and the Prime Minister know about the espionage and blatant violation of our sovereignty, and when did they decide to cover it up?
The exact opposite of a cover-up occurred. It's actually this government that created the process that released these documents.
Okay, that exchange followed news that CSIS believes 2 scientists fired from the Winnipeg microbiology lab in 2019 were working to benefit China. The revelations came out of hundreds of documents tabled in Parliament yesterday, and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre went a step further, suggesting a political motive for keeping details of the case secret until now.
Not only did he cover it up, not only did he try to get a vaccine from China after knowing this, he called a snap election to make sure that the voting would happen before this came out. And what happened in that election? Beijing interfered to help him win it.
Okay, the he in that is the Prime Minister, and Justin Trudeau had a pointed response accusing Poilievre of weaponizing national security for partisan gain.
There's lots of opportunity to have responsible political debates about how we're moving forward as a country and what needs to be fixed, but the choice to weaponize national security in a way that is rife with conspiracy theories and partisan attacks is a choice that I don't think is worthy of the kind of responsible leadership that Canadians deserve.
Okay, this is the next item up for bids for the Power Panel. Tanda McCharles, Andrew Thompson, James Moore, and Jonathan Kalis. James, start with what Pierre Poilievre said there today, suggesting that the Prime Minister did all of this knowing that Beijing might help him win the election. That's pulling a lot of threads together that aren't necessarily supported by what was tabled in Parliament yesterday.
What I don't understand about the government's response to the CSIS report, I mean, and Minister Holland has a very calm demeanor and presentation, is the length that they've gone over 4 years now to not disclose information that's clearly in the public interest. And further, now that it's been publicly disclosed and it's out there and the government has known about this for years, why has there not been a directive given to this lab to cut any ties whatsoever with Beijing and with the Chinese government, given that we know that this is a hostile actor that is here to steal information from Canada and to use information in part of a Chinese biological, conceivably, weapons program, given the actors who are on the other side? Further, Zhangguo Xu, who is the doctor who's at question here, she's apparently in China. How does that happen? How does somebody who's under now RCMP investigation, suspicion of being a participant in espionage, possibly a participant in activities that are against the government of Canada's interest in terms of national security, how is she allowed to go to China and to get out of this? And the government goes out of its way to cover up these documents. This opens up a world of questions, including the ones that Pierre Poilievre raised on the political side, but a world of questions that are only beginning to be curated in terms of a long list that the government's going to have to answer for.
Right, but James, these documents did come out after, a committee of parliamentarians with the help of judges, similar to the Afghan detainee document process. And it was offered in 2019 for this to go to NSICOP, which is the National Security Committee of parliamentarians, to look at these documents. So I know it took forever, and I know there was fights, but there were opportunities.
As we talked about before, could have been shared at any time with Pierre Poilievre or Michael Chung, both of whom are privy councillors who do have security clearance. If the government did genuinely want to share these things, so that, as Justin Trudeau just said, he doesn't want the rhetoric of this to get out of control, and he wants to deal with these things in a serious, responsible way when it comes to national security, then share the documents with your fellow privy councillors and treat this stuff seriously, as Jean Chrétien did when he shared national security information with then opposition leaders Stephen Harper and Jack Layton around 9/11. There's a way to do this, and Justin Trudeau should show the leadership.
Well, Jonathan, on that, they tried to do that around foreign interference, and Mr. Poilievre refused to be bound by the secrecy requirements of seeing some of the documents because he wanted the freedom to talk about it. So I don't know what your thought is on whether that's a viable path forward or not, given the environment we're operating in right now.
I mean, that's the bit of a hypocrisy there. I understand what James is saying, but it's not just a matter of being a member of the Privy Council and a foreign minister. He's refused to see top secret documents in the past because he wants to be able to go out in question period, say absolutely anything he wants because he's parliamentary privilege, and even in scrums and press conferences, make allegations, make suggestions, make connections, somewhat conspiratorial, and not, say, well, it's not my responsibility. So he can't have it both ways, but he's trying, and he's fairly effective at it. He's been on the Chinese interference issue and on this one now, the question is, yes, it could have gone faster. And yes, the Liberals were concerned about the politics of this. And I think the biggest problem the Liberals have had here is they've generally been very cautious, especially when it comes to national security. And caution is good when it comes to national security. But even beyond national security, when there are really questionable things, we could talk about ArriveCan last week. They act cautiously. They don't really want to point fingers right away because they're afraid that maybe somebody will also accuse them. Like Pierre Poilievre, every time that there's anything, says this is Justin Trudeau's fault. Now, Justin Trudeau doesn't sit and investigate the Winnipeg lab before anything happens and keep surveillance and make sure that secret information is remaining secret. At some point, it gets to him. But Pierre Poilievre wants to paint him as responsible for everything. So the problem that the Liberals have is they take that, and they're always afraid that they're going to be, the finger is going to be pointed at them when maybe it's 20 levels below, and they let the process play out. Here, they look like they dragged their feet. They look like they were trying to cover it up. I don't think that that's what happened. Again, you said it. And NSI COP could have met in 2019-20. I want to throw in one other timing factor, which is they were treading carefully and cautiously in 2019 and early 2020, but in 2019 in particular, because of the two Michaels being in jail. And so you were pointing fingers at China, but you were doing it cautiously because you were always being careful not to push too far because they had two Canadians that who knew what they would do to them. And my question has always been, now that they've been released, now that we're clearly have this hostility between the two countries, why aren't we just being more forthright and saying, pointing a finger at China?
Well, Tanya, those are all good questions, right?
Good questions,
and yes, the two Michaels were taken in December of 2018. Also at the height of this, the pandemic happened, and the Wuhan microbiology lab, and all of these sort of connections there were, I guess, concerns there. But they could have had this out probably a little bit quicker and without some of the drama around it, it seems. But I don't know if that could have worked without the cooperation of the Conservatives.
We're talking all around process really here, aren't we?
True.
We're talking process. And yes, there was a complex backdrop while this was unfolding behind closed doors in the government, how to deal with these two scientists. There was the geopolitical problem and there was the pandemic medical issue. But I think that now that the documents are out, I think that it does raise some very serious issues around what we consider a national security reason and what we don't to deal swiftly with people like this.
Right.
It raises questions about, to what extent were we being naive about China? Are we continuing to be naive about China? To what extent Canadian researchers and their ties to China? Because China, before Xi Jinping came in, Chinese researchers and Canadian researchers collaborated quite a bit to advance knowledge. The whole world changed with Xi Jinping coming into power. And so I wonder, when I read these documents, it was, to me, many things in there were shocking. The suggestion that Canadian IP was being stolen, the suggestions of economic espionage and all of that. I think Mr. Poilievre has to be careful because there's enough in there to already take on the government for, without going so far as to say, and they were linked to bioterrorism, and they were this and that. There's enough in there that's disturbing, that warrants serious examination by Parliament and parliamentarians, in my view, and we haven't really begun to really plumb those documents for all those questions.
Yeah, and Andrew, to get a little bit granular for a second, the assessment of this in 2019 was very different than the assessment in 2021. If you look at the two CSIS assessments that were released, in 2019, they thought these two scientists might be vulnerable to foreign interference. And by 2021, they're like, oh no, this is a real problem. They have to go. Like they're working directly with China and lying about everything. So, it evolved over time. Just your thoughts on where we are on this.
Well, I think Tonda's right. I mean, part of what's happening here is this has now become a big political issue. Mm-hmm. I would argue, James's articulation of what should be put forward as the prosecution of the issue is much more effective than what Pierre Poilievre put forward today, where everything, is some weird string that connects back to another, which is somehow about the government ending up calling an election. Probably not likely. But the government certainly did have insight long before these documents were made public. They had the kind of intelligence, they had the mechanisms to be dealing with this, and they didn't. And I think that is a big political question. Why didn't they? Could be, as mentioned about the two Michaels, that may have been the issue in 2019, 2020. But by 2021, how is it that we've lost track of the scientists involved? How is it that they end up back in China? How is it that this government doesn't seem to actually be able to govern or to run an administration which is able to do these two things at once? Yes, there's a geopolitical issue always at play. And I will say the government has taken steps since then to really take to heart the question about espionage, especially in the research community. Mm-hmm. And that is in place now, and I think will work very effectively in dealing with threats from overseas. But this question of how they managed to lose track of the scientists, why they weren't held on national security certificates or some other kind of at least refusal to allow them easy access out of the country, why this it does appear to have been covered up for so long and simply not acted on when the government had the information itself really is quite damning on both sides. But the political mistake, and just to go back to how James had framed the argument, I think part of the political mistake that Pierre Poilievre is making on this and so many other issues is there's an old saying that you should never confuse the fact that the public will hate your political opposition as much as you do. And I think that is the big mistake that he's making, trying to draw everything to that. There is lots of damnation to be cast on this government's handling of it. I don't think very much of it goes towards how they ended up calling the 21 election.
So James, just on that, there was an insinuation there that the election was called to cover this up and China helped Trudeau get elected in 2021. Yesterday, we saw Mr. Poilievre in question period refer to Mike Moffat, who's an advocate on housing, been very critical of his government. He referred to him as like a failed liberal academic. And there is enough there without adding to it, it seems to me. And I mean, what do you make of that particular impulse and execution over the last couple of days?
I'm sure Pierre will respect your constructive criticism about how he can manage things.
Yeah. I'm under no illusions, but I just want to ask. I wanted to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, but look, we've spent more time in the panel scrutinizing Pierre Poilievre than we have, the matter at hand, which is, the matter at hand. Dr. Xu was fired. I searching the CBC website. Dr. Xu was fired 4 years ago. 4 years ago, she was dismissed for lying about her engagement with the Chinese government, lying about the information that she was retaining and sharing illegally with the Chinese government. And she was thrown out of the building. Everybody else in the building was told not to have any communication with her. Her computers were taken away. Her access codes and passes were all taken away. That's 4 years. That's 4 years ago that espionage was done, and there's not been a coherent explanation to Canadians in the context of a backdrop today where Canada is not meeting its 2% NATO spending target. We can't seem to procure F-35s at all, let alone rationally procure ships, let alone be a trusted members of the Five Eyes community, let alone be brought into AUKUS or other global security dynamics when we have an increasingly hostile world all around us, that Canada's capacity to be taken seriously internationally, whether it comes to military spending, thought leadership, capacity when it comes to intelligence and acting responsibly and sharing this information with Canadians and with our allies is all now in doubt, And so I think the government has a very steep hill to climb in terms of trying to recalibrate and reassert itself with any kind of credibility on these matters.
But Jonathan, just as a final point, the role Parliament played in this, right? Because the Parliament has a role, and NSI COP it didn't work then in 2019. They tried to do it again later. The Conservatives boycotted NSI COP in 2022 for a period of time. So we set up these institutions that are supposed to deal with it. And James, and I'm putting the blame on the Conservatives, but like, if these institutions exist and these committees exist and these processes exist to deal with a moment like this, they have to function, or everything just becomes about politics and rather than about parliamentarians and the national. Sorry, James, go in and then let Jonathan.
I'll just say the committee isn't the government. The government is the government. Maybe
I understand.
NSI COP should
That's exactly it.
Treated differently at the time. But these documents wouldn't have been shared with NSI COP. Nobody believes that.
I have no idea. Maybe.
So the committee isn't the government. The government's the government, and the government dropped the ball. Right. Sorry, I took time.
No. It's an important point, and I appreciate the intervention, Jonathan. So you're going to get the last word.
I think Parliament has just not functioned properly, and that's probably on everybody in terms of whether NSA COP is a good idea, but it really hasn't been as effective as it could have or should have been. I would have liked to have seen it be more effective. I think the idea is not just novel. I think it has the ability to do those sort of in-camera studies of top secret materials so that at least all parties are represented, and people, they have an input separate from the government. There should be those checks and balances, and unfortunately, it hasn't worked. Yes, there's been boycotts by the Conservatives. That's definitely part of it. But overall, it just has not been a great functioning body. And I think that's something that if we can get to multi-partisan agreement on anything, that would be one. Because again, going back to the underlying thing here, there is a security breach. There's serious national security issues. And those aren't the issues being talked about. And, at the end of the day, this just becomes politicized. It's a matter of whose fault it is and putting blame instead of finding solutions. I hope someone down the line in National Security Agency, at CSIS, in National Defense, are actually working on this and ignoring the politics of what goes on both in Parliament and between the government and the opposition.
Yep, and to reinforce your point, James, we talked about NSI Cop a lot last year at the height of the foreign interference stuff, and what we learned is that this government ignored all of their recommendations or were very slow to act on it. So you're not wrong, but if we're going to have these institutions, they need to function and they need to be listened to. Otherwise, what's the point, right? That was the point I was trying to make on that. But look, gang, thank you so much. We're out of time. Appreciate it. Andrew Thompson, Jonathan Kalis, James Moore, and Tana McCharles. We'll see you soon.